Welcome to the Neo Medieval Ledger. I'm Samuel Dempsey, and today I had the pleasure of speaking with Maria Martisiute. Maria is a policy analyst at the European Policy Center focusing on defense, security, and foreign affairs. We had, I think, what is one of the most important conversations that needs to be had in Europe today. We talked about European security and defense and what it means to have a European security and defense with or without the United States. We talked about Russia's incursions into Poland. We talked about Russia's daily cyber attacks on Poland. We talked about Zapad 2025, the military exercise that took place in Belarus with Russia and with U.S. military observers. We talked about the growing connection between Russian-backed far-right parties in Europe and the United States. And we talked about what is necessary for European defense procurement. What is actually necessary to get Europe on a wartime economy that can truly generate an industry that can defend itself with or without the United States. Maria is truly one of the most creative and leading voices on European security in Brussels. She has over 10 years of experience working on these issues at NATO, the EU, national administrations in London and Vilnius, and in the industry and in NGOs. She worked at NATO on reform in defense and security sectors with partners in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. And she took the personal lead in restructuring the directorate and shaping NATO's cooperative security trust fund reforms. She also volunteered in this role in Afghanistan in 2021 and Ukraine in 2022. Before that, she was at the European Commission on EU strategic investments in 3 network infrastructures. She focused on innovative financing, impact assessment, Eastern Europe, and the Rail Baltica project. Her insights in this conversation today are at the forefront of what is important in Europe. She is truly a leading voice on this issue and a voice that needs to be heard right now. With that, here's my conversation with Maria. Maria, it's wonderful to have you here. I see you as being a really clear voice in Brussels on what is the state of European security and also what is the threat of Russia right now. So thank you so much for taking the time and really excited to speak with you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so I want to paint a picture of just all the things that have happened in the last few weeks, and it has been quite eventful, so bear with me. But we had Russian drones violating Polish airspace. We had 19 in one night. The EU responded with the drone wall, which is a Ukrainian-made drone system that will be deployed by 2027, so it will come eventually. And NATO responded with Operation Eastern Sentry, which is a quick reaction fighter jets deployed along the eastern flank. And it keeps going. I mean, after that, Russia then violated Romania's airspace again, and NATO aircrafts then escorted the Russian drone back into its airspace. Poland now announced that it has a record $1 billion, cybersecurity budget after facing the daily Russian sabotage targeting hospitals and water systems. And then there was Zapad 2025, the large-scale joint military exercise between Russia and Belarus. And this time, and sorry, Zapad for listeners means west. So that's the direction they see their force as oriented. And this time, U.S. military observers were there, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But just really, how do you make sense of this moment, of all the things happening? And do you think this European response has been adequate to this moment?
Well, we haven't really done our homework because there have been signals all along that this is just a question of time until NATO's or EU's resolve, preparedness, deterrence is going to be tested. And we had occasional one-off intrusions in the Baltic states, in Poland. We didn't really do anything about that, did we? We didn't actually give a clear signal. You violated, you breached our space, regardless of your intent, regardless whether it's an accident or whether it's actually deliberate spying drone, or something like this. No, it violates your space. You deliver a message that you're not welcome. There are consequences. You're being neutralized. In fact, I think this only encouraged actors like Russia to actually, test on a bit larger scale, which is what we saw in Poland recently with 19 drones. And this is not going to stop, and this is not going to stop even when we have a drone wall or when we have Eastern Sentry with NATO. So it's important that we do our homework and be prepared for any scenario and across all domains. What is encouraging to me about Eastern Sentry is that it's multi-domain. I would like to really see how that's going to be implemented, because I assume it is not only new tech and, counter-drone measures, but hopefully broader air defense systems combined, with greater land forces, but also warships, cybersecurity measures in all domains, literally, and more integrated, more interoperable. And for me, it's not clear whether it is just covering Poland or whether it is Eastern Front Line. That I still
Mm.
haven't figured out myself. So it's only going to get worse. And I mean, I smile, but this is
Yeah,
really
it's terrifying.
serious. And I think it also shows that deterrence has limits. This is why I talk about the need to, in terms of NATO's posture, to actually gradually demonstrate warfighting posture
Mm.
across all the front lines.
And you talk about signals, and I want to kind of circle back to the instance in Romania. I mean, do you think that was a signal to escort the Russian drone back into Russian airspace, or what to you would be a signal that would actually show Russia, hey, we mean business, and you cannot violate our sovereignty?
Well, we need to, in our response, to speak the language that these aggressors understand, and they have very different standards from us. And this is where our weakness. I mean, we're very proud of our transparency, rule of law, international law. That's great, fantastic. But when that's being exploited, when we're being taken advantage of, and not just taken advantage of, we're being attacked. Okay, there haven't been casualties, but what if there had been?
Yeah.
That would be too late. Polls say, no buildings really were damaged apart from, I think, one residential house. I mean, are you kidding me? Like, I don't want to wait until there is actual mass casualties or
Yeah.
greater damage. And it's not just about, the lives of people. It's the fact that they collect information, the fact that they learn how quickly we react or how quickly we don't react. What is our decision-making procedure? What are the obstacles? So that they gather this information and push harder next time, because they will.
Yeah. And this is exactly kind of, I think, the issue of how I see it. I see it that NATO is already at war with Russia because Russia is already at war with NATO.
Absolutely.
And, I don't think this is something that many within the policy making of NATO are addressing maybe head on. Maybe I'm wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong. And it seems to me that while Russia is truly fighting this gray zone warfare, we often are on the back foot and sometimes literally with our tail between our legs. And so what explains that? I mean, we are truly the more powerful player here, yet by the way in which escalation is occurring and who gets to define red lines, it doesn't really seem that is the case in practice.
I love that you use the word reactionary, because this is also how I see this. And I think that's a very good word that, captures it very well. We are not the ones taking initiative to actually deter sufficiently enough Russia and Belarus. And again, we need to do our homework, but we also need to become a force in
Mm.
our own right. There are a lot of reasons why Europe is slow, indecisive, so dependent on the United States, lacking courage, actually lacking belief in itself, I think.
Yeah.
Because we do have enough resources, we do have enough capabilities, we could scale up manufacturing of weapons, especially if we do it jointly with Ukraine, very speedily. But I think we are, still having hopes about America, still hoping that Trump will see with time that Putin doesn't want peace, that he will see that America needs also Europe, that we are a good partner and ally. And I think maybe this is also what's stopping us. Yeah. And
Sorry,
go
go ahead, please. No, we'll get to the United States in a moment because it really is the elephant in the room and must be addressed. I see that Russia is really trying to grind down NATO, it appears, and it's able to kind of push this gray area. And like you're saying, there's this lack of confidence in Europe itself. But, what do you think is the kind of medium-term goal for Russia in this endeavor? I mean, I would put it that this is to kind of erode at the cohesiveness of NATO and wait for a vulnerable moment and move to take the Baltics or part of Poland. Do you see that to be the way this is, or a true war of attrition in this way, or what's your interpretation?
Well, my interpretation is, like you said just a minute ago, we are already at war, at least from Russia's perspective. Actually, they're openly saying that. And one of the domains where this is actually happening, and this is prior to the drone breaches of our NATO's airspace, is hybrid attacks on our infrastructure all over the place. Undersea cables, GPS jamming and spoofing, cyber attacks, and, weaponization of migrants on the border. I mean, what have you? I mean, it's a whole set of kind of below Article 5 attacks that are destabilizing, actually overwhelming our defenses.
Mm.
And this is where I would think that one of the ways Russia is not going to change.
Yeah.
And I think a change has to come from us. And one of the ways to, undercut Russia is in fact to stop talking about hybrid attacks as some gray space between war and peace. Are you kidding me? Like, if you tell me you're not sure where you are, if you're not at war, but we're not at peace, I'm really worried at your situation, like this type of language only feeds Russian actions and narratives. I think we need to be very clear and define hybrid attacks or these below Article 5 attacks as also a kind of a form of war, a form of act of aggression. So perhaps we need to enlarge our legal frameworks and definitions, because maybe we're no longer relevant talking just and waiting for an armed aggression.
Yeah. And so you talked about this self-belief that Europe maybe is lacking. I mean, do you have the belief that Europe can rise to this moment and do what is necessary?
I remain optimistic. Because I think that if there was a stronger attacks, like what I mean by strong attack, let's say.
What is that line, actually? Yeah, that's interesting. Where do you think it would take?
I think it would be something cyber military, something simultaneous that would be very confusing at first, very destabilizing. We would need to take time to establish the facts as to what is happening. I think countries would actually come in support of Baltic states and Poland, the European countries.
European countries, yeah.
Now, whether America would come in, I hope so, but I'm not sure. But I remain optimistic that Europe will realize that the only way to end the war in Ukraine and the only way to indeed deter Russia is in a military fashion.
Yeah.
And that the only security guarantees is Article 5. And I think perhaps it will be too late. I hope not when we come to that realization. But I think, going in circles, but eventually we will come back to it. Because Russia will not stop. It can only reconstitute with a pause and strike again. And where I am worried, and this will actually bring me into more domestic affairs, is if extreme parties in Germany or in France actually succeed, not only being in a position as strong parties, but succeed in, getting majorities.
Yeah.
Because then Russia will not need to even attack us. And I think this is what Russia is also
counting on.
Expecting and playing with, because the level of disinformation, the level of financing and networking with extreme parties is very significant, because then Russia would not actually need to launch any violent attack. The Baltics could then be just given to it.
Yeah, I'm happy you bring this up, because this, to me, is the kind of the elephant within the elephant of the room of the role or lack thereof of the United States. And we actually just saw this week that AfD leaders were invited to visit the White House. This is a German political party with known Russian ties that is very much in line with the interests of the Kremlin. And to continue kind of on in this last few weeks what we've seen from the United States, there was U.S. military observers at Zapad 2025. This is the first time that this has happened since the full-scale invasion. It's kind of an odd decision, and many NATO allies were furious, and I think rightfully so. And then I think an important point is that there is no, right now at least, or that I'm aware of, or it's publicly disclosed, there's no U.S. military involvement in Eastern Sentry. So, I mean, I think it's fair to say Europe is going at this alone. I think Europe is slow to wake up to that, and I think that's being optimistic and saying it like that. But I would go a step further and say that the U.S. in many ways is working opposed to the interest of Europe. I mean, these parties that you're talking about are directly involved with Elon Musk and Donald Trump and, the current MAGA movement. So how do we view a European role with the U.S.? How do we view the transatlantic relationship that has been built upon a strong and willing U.S. ally?
So the short answer is Europe is walking on thin ice here with America. But you touched on many other points, and I'll just want to quickly respond. One was the AfD going to Washington. And indeed, there's closeness. They share a close relationship, AfD and the whole MAGA, I would say, and Trump administration. AfD is positioning. AfD is positioning because they did pretty well in German snap elections in February 2025. I think they came second with 20 something result. Just, I think last week there were elections in the most populous German state, North Westphalia, and there they almost tripled their results. So it's no longer just the former Eastern Germany, it's also the rest of the Germany that is slowly going into believing and buying into the narratives of AfD. And AfD is positioning. They need political support. They're trying to understand how come Trump succeeded. They are learning about electoral laws and processes. And our mainstream parties, need to ask very hard questions. What are they going to do about it? How are they going to win back the populations? Are they doing enough? Are they conversing and communicating enough? So this is a real danger. And we saw already indeed in J.D. Vance in Munich, what many Europeans felt was an assault on liberal democracy. So this is the big danger for Europe. Now, when it comes to Zapad exercises and the fact that there was US involvement there, that did come as a surprise. At the same time, knowing that in roughly around the same days, the US has lifted some of the sanctions on Belarus, such as on Belarus national airline Belavia, shows that there is a thaw or rapprochement in terms of US-Belarus relations. In exchange, Belarus released about 50 political prisoners to Lithuania. And it could be interpreted, as a way that maybe the US is trying to pull Belarus a bit away from Russia and develop its own partnership and have leverage there, which I think is very naive. Let's be clear, these Boeing parts that Belarus will acquire from the US will be sold or given even to Russia to propel their war. And the fact that indeed there was US soldiers, again, Putin sniffs weakness here because America increasingly sees Russia, Belarus as potential partners rather than aggressors, rather than threats. So, like I said, Europe is walking thin ice also because, there are questions about reliability and Europeans are confused because they're used to America consulting Europe about matters affecting European security, being involved in decision-making with America. But with Trump, it's a very different worldview. So, again, Europe needs to be prepared for every scenario. I'm very much looking forward to the outcomes of US Global Posture Review and the National Defense Security Strategy, which will only reconfirm that European security is a secondary or even tertiary order in terms of priority for America. So we need to be prepared for the worst.
So I'd like to pivot to kind of what is central to Europe going at this alone, what it means to have a defense industry and a defense capability without the United States. And, I'll start that I'm an American. I've worked on the nearly $1 trillion, National Defense Authorization Act in Congress. I've seen what it takes inside this kind of machine to create a defense industry and create a defense power. And I would attribute that to the NDAA, which is a centralization of a procurement process. And in Europe, we have, 350 billion on defense total. At EU level, of course, we have the, European Defense Fund and the Peace Facility. And this is, I think, like under 20 billion that this comes out to. And now there's a new development with the European Defense Funds, which I'd love your input on, that, this is the first issuance of kind of the ability for civil society to buy into this private sector. But still, it only adds, I think, 750 million euros to the market. So it's a big move, but it's a small gain in the short term. And then we have Readiness 2030. And Readiness 2030 is, this plan to reach 800 billion euros cumulative over the decade, not in an annual budget. And so this is kind of like how I would assess, where Europe's at in doing this defense process. And this is in contrast to the US, of course, with this $1 trillion machine that every year is getting oiled and refined. But then we have Russia with a full-scale war economy. It's spending 145 billion annually. And we know that its purchasing power and efficiency actually stretches much further to that because it's in this war economy. And so yes, Europe spends twofold on defense, but I don't think it gets 2 times the force posture actually in its outcome. I think that it would probably need, 3 to 4 times more to reach parity in deterrence. So the question is simple, all of that put. Can Europe do that? And how can Europe do that?
Europe could do that if it had enough courage, because we do have enough
Yeah.
resources. Resources is not a problem in Europe. And you're absolutely right. Public money is not enough. We need to have loans, guarantees, issue bonds. In fact, as my colleague likes to say, and I absolutely support that, there is no war in history that hasn't been won without borrowing.
Mm.
And you need to ask yourself a question: what do we want to bring to our future generations? A debt? No, or future war?
Yeah.
What is better? And I think the United Kingdom actually just returned its World War I debt in 2015, a century later. Have we really felt that? I don't know, but maybe it saved them in the war. So Europe lacks courage. Europe also lacks urgency. It pains me that at this stage, 3 years into war in Ukraine, and now touching even the airspace and our undersea critical infrastructure, for example, or satellites, that we are still haven't properly integrated our procurement procedures. That while I congratulate this omnibus simplification for defense, we need to move faster. We are literally in pre-war period. If you consider that warnings from intelligence authorities of Germany, Poland, Scandinavia, and Britain are true, in a sense that, we might be at war with Russia between 2027 and 2029, maybe 2030. So we're literally in the pre-war period, but we're not acting like we are. I think we should be amending laws. We should be integrating, including with Ukraine, building long-term demand for military capabilities, and sprinting towards that. If necessary, I think maybe we could, to speed up things without frightening people and publics, but declare an emergency.
Yeah.
That is a European national emergency, that, there is a war. Now it's even on our borders. America is actually very clear that Europe needs to take more responsibility for its own security and defense. So indeed, we lack courage. We don't have time, really,
And
in my opinion.
let's say that courage gets there. Let's pray it happens. It needs to happen. And when that courage happens, I mean, how do we integrate and centralize this to actually create long-term demand? Because as an American, I'll bring it back to the NDAA. Part of why the NDAA works so well, I mean, maybe too well, some would say, but the reason it works so well is because it's legislators that are on the Armed Services Committee. So these are legislators that normally have a background in national security, they have a background in military, and so they know each year what the demand roughly needs to be. They're invested in that. So they can kind of pinpoint it and develop it without having to get up to speed. Whereas, a lot of European countries, it's all legislators, to my understanding, that are working on it. So many that, maybe are housing experts or infrastructure experts, whatever it may be. So I see that maybe as a little bit issue. And then in Europe, of course, there's not this, centralization at all. You have these small funds here and there. So, I mean, do you think it is, I mean, I, of course, have this specific angle where I see it maybe as necessary to come closer to an NDA-like process. Do you see that the same way? And do you think there's capability for that, or is there a better alternative?
Well, European defense market is very fragmented, and this is what European Union is trying to tackle with this European Defense Industrial Strategy, creation of industrial base. But indeed, what the challenge is that in Europe, defense policy is a matter of national sovereignty. EU is not a federation, which is the case in the United States. They would indeed need to, first of all, do an inventory or scoping exercise to determine where the gaps are, because we don't have that overview. I don't even think NATO has that overview, because it's usually in the hands of member states and the industry. What are the critical gaps across all domains? What do we need to, reach capability targets such that in case we need to activate NATO's defense plans, that we have those capabilities, and stimulate to the market and to the investors long-term demand, place orders, long-term orders, and unite with Ukraine. In fact, I would go as far as to say that we need to open our defense market to Ukraine, instead of keep it closed or keep it, as a subcontractor in joint procurement. I think it should be on equal footing, and it is not. Because they are, for the moment, a thriving, perhaps the largest and most agile defense market. They have over 500 companies, about 300,000 people working. Over 30% of Ukraine's GDP goes for defense.
Yeah.
The cycles of innovation are incredible. Bi-weekly or monthly basis, there's new technology that is being tested and developed on the ground. So if we are, as they say at NATO, aiming for the very best, we should be doing that in concert with Ukraine and enabling it. The problem also I see in Europe is actually troops and human resource problem, because while we are moving slowly in terms of, some harmonization of standards or common procurement, we're not
Yeah.
doing anything about our troops, really, apart from a few countries where it is conscription. We're not even talking to populations. The exception is a little bit to frontline countries and Scandinavia, but even there are considerable gaps. Because what are we going to do if indeed there is armed aggression? Where is the force that we are going to mobilize? And in fact, here again, Ukraine comes, into the spotlight, because they are our frontline for the moment. In fact, we are learning the readiness and battlefield techniques from them as well, not just training them.
Yeah. So I very quickly want to end on this Ukraine kind of conversation. So I firmly believe integration is necessary, but I think part of why we're not seeing that is I think many Europeans are still under the perception that this is a losing war and that part of Ukraine or much of Ukraine will have to be given up at some point. And you have been one of the most creative people I think I've seen in trying to generate solutions to this, of how to create security guarantees for Ukraine, how to actually bring about a positive end as much as possible to this war. So what are your thoughts quickly on Ukraine and NATO, on the close the skies debate, if NATO should, maybe not integrate fully right now Ukraine into NATO, but at least ensure an aerial dimension that puts Ukraine in a better fighting position and could enable some sort of peace. And you've had other creative solutions about, having platoons being sent to Asia to kind of have like a incentive for the U.S. to be more involved. A lot of interesting things. So quickly, because I know you've not so much time, but where do you see all of this?
With pleasure. Absolutely. I think Ukraine needs to be at the core of Europe's and Euro-Atlantic defense and deterrence posture and war-fighting posture. And we do have security guarantees in the scope of G7, but are they working? I mean, Ukraine negotiated, actually, UK, I think, was the first one some years ago now, negotiating security guarantees, but it looks like, no one is obliged to really come into Ukraine when there are new attacks. So it just makes me think that we need to revisit our current existing frameworks and ask ourselves, are they relevant and adequate enough?
Yeah.
In order to, shield us from aggression and protect Ukraine. So I absolutely still believe that the best security guarantee for Ukraine is Russia's defeat on the battlefield. The second best is NATO's membership for Ukraine. Now that Germany has shifted position on Ukraine's NATO membership, I know what Trump hasn't yet, but I don't know, for me, what is a European or national strategic emergency, shouldn't we, perhaps amending some of our treaties in order to have majorities rather than vetoes, in order to
yes.
allow to reinvigorate NATO rather than be so static. Second of all, it's important to have America on board. There are limits to what America will do, but even those limits are important, particularly while we are transitioning into our military capabilities, such as air-to-air fuel, surveillance, intelligence, and so on. And, since Trump is so much about trade deals and cares so much about Asia-Pacific or regional missions, recently, there was a military strike on these 11 Venezuelans, smugglers and gang. So I was just wondering why Europeans, including Ukraine, don't make an offer to United States operations abroad, be it Asia-Pacific, be it at other global regions and theaters, in order to lock in America in Europe and in Ukraine. Because indeed, this war in Ukraine is ultimately in our backyard. It's Europe's responsibility. If we lock in America, maybe we can offer our troops and our capabilities for America's overseas deployments, at least to have that conversation. And why it also makes sense is because ultimately what we have in Ukraine is North Korean troops, is, Iranian drones and other global, from the global South countries' contributions. So as a minimum, I think we need now to move within no-fly zone or securitization of Ukraine's sky, and I just can't understand why we haven't done it yet. I can't even understand why we haven't done it in 2021 when we saw Russia amassing troops on Ukraine's border. I mean, if at that moment we moved in, Ukraine's request to cover the skies, as independent Ukraine's decision, and here, American, NATO, European forces come in, cater the sky. What would Russia would have done?
Yeah, I argue not much. I
Not
think
much.
Russia
They
is
would have
quite
backed
scared of
off.
conventional conflict with NATO.
Exactly. They need to see, that we are serious about it, that we are taking action, and not just reactionary, but being proactive, being the force of initiative.
Well, Maria, thank you so much for this. This was extremely insightful and extremely important, and I hope that more European leaders and policymakers within NATO as well can incorporate the things that you're talking about. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the New Medieval Ledger. If you enjoyed today's podcast, then please like, subscribe, and share with your community. If there are ideas that you would like to be heard on the show, email me. My email is analysis@samuel-dempsey.com. And I hope to see you next week for our next episode.